Now, there's been chaos on global markets overnight on a scale not seen since the depths of the COVID pandemic. US markets have suffered the heaviest losses, with trillions of dollars wiped in the wake of Donald Trump's wide-ranging tariffs. We're going to get some analysis on what it all means in just a second. But first, let's go to our North America correspondent, Lauren Day, who is across all the breaking developments for us. Lauren, well, where to start? Just talk us through what has happened overnight.
Morning, James. It's been absolutely remarkable. You called it chaos. I've been trying to find a noun to settle on. The Wall Street Journal calls it a wipeout. The New York Times said it was a plunge. CNN called it carnage. But no matter what language you use, this is clearly the worst single day that the US markets have seen since the beginning of the COVID pandemic back in 2020. We've seen in total about $3.1 trillion US dollars wiped off the markets. To break it down, the S&P fell by 4.8%, the Dow Jones by almost 4%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq down almost 6%. And that's because stocks like Apple, Google, Nvidia, Amazon all had heavy losses, as did retailers like Nike, Target, Ralph Lauren, which all have major production hubs in China and Southeast Asia, which of course were major targets in yesterday's announced tariffs on so-called Liberation Day. Now, one thing that I think is really important to mention as well is that these share market falls also have big implications for a lot of people's retirement funds here. Those pension funds or 401ks in America are invested in the stocks and bonds, and so any volatility like this can cause big drops and actually delay people's ability to retire. So a lot of people will be watching with interest what the markets do from here, and this will really test people's patience as well. We've seen people from the Trump administration, including Vice President JD Vance, urge voters to be patient. But I think when people start seeing price rises or job losses, or they have to delay their retirement, that will really test their patience.
It will. Lauren, how is the rest of the world responding this morning?
Well, global leaders are just reeling from these tariff announcements. They're trying to figure out, I guess, whether to retaliate with their own tariffs or other kinds of barriers, or whether to negotiate with the Trump administration. But the White House has thrown some cold water on that idea and the possibility of doing deals. They've said this is not a negotiation, this is a national emergency. Now, we've seen some countries already announce their own retaliatory measures. China, for example, Canada, the EU, which is the US's biggest trading partner. Here's what some global leaders have had to say.
The decision announced last night was both brutal and unfounded. Unfounded because you don't correct trade imbalances by putting tariffs in place. The basics of economic theory show the opposite.
Three different sets of U.S. tariffs remain in place and will continue to pose significant threats to Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. They are all unjustified, unwarranted, and in our judgment, misguided.
We stand for multilateralism and free trade, and we will respond to any attempt to impose protectionism, which no longer has a place in today's world.
And obviously, James, Australian leaders are also scrambling to try to respond to this and figure out what to do in the wake of these tariffs. Australia obviously got off relatively lightly compared to some other countries, but still faces big hits with that 10% tariff. We've seen Anthony Albanese's 5-point plan that includes that $50 million package for sectors that have been impacted. Peter Dutton has come out and said that Australia should leverage its military alliance with the US to try to get some kind of carve-out or exemption from this, but it looks like exemptions are highly unlikely. I mean, Donald Trump said when he announced this yesterday on what he called Liberation Day that this would affect friend and foe alike.
Lauren, thank you for that. Now, we brought you the markets earlier. You really don't need to be a financial expert to see that it's bad. It's all red, it's all pointing down. And for more reaction, we're joined now by James Kirby from the Australian Money Puzzle podcast. James, good morning. This is all happening, right? Because markets had priced some of this in, but they didn't think it would be quite as bad as it's turned out to be.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a sense that they mightn't be as bad as he had predicted, and of course they were more severe across the board. And so the market response, this is quite sharp, right? This is the worst day since the worst day of the start of COVID, where the markets, it was the day of reckoning, basically, where people said, oh, this is actually for real. Yeah. It's exactly what's happening with the tariffs. And there isn't a professional fund manager in the world or an economist in the world that says tariffs are good. It's a political move, not an economic move, and it was going to hit, and here it is. And the irony is, of course, it's hitting the US hardest.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see exactly what happens there. But of course, we saw what happened on the stock market, and potentially that could, a lot of turmoil over coming days, if not weeks or more. What's going to happen with people's super?
What's interesting, Lauren, just there talking about the US, people worried about, it's the exact same here, of course. But there's actually a point here that's probably not so obvious and unfortunate in the context of exactly where we are. The US markets basically, as I've mentioned many times, the US markets drive all markets. And in Australia, we're mostly dependent on big super funds. And it just so happens, and this is not good timing, that a few months ago, if you recall, the regulators were expressing concern that our super funds are so big that they're worried about them dominating the Australian market, right? Because they own about a third of all shares. So our Australian super funds have been shifting money into the US just these last few months. They've also been dropping their sort of cash levels, which is their defensive levels. A Deutsche Bank report just a few days ago, which was a report that was sent around to institutional investors around the world, making the point that Australian super funds have never been exposed to the share market so much, particularly the US market. So they've, in a way, they've walked straight into this. So our own retirement funds, I'm not saying that people will have to push their retirement out because of what happened today, but there is a structural change in our super which has made us more exposed to the US than ever before at the worst possible time, just as we get these very bad days.
Now, it is very difficult to predict what's going to happen with inflation and all the rest of it. However, initially, it seems that the reaction is, well, let's maybe cut rates here a little bit quicker than we were initially going to.
Yeah, the thing on rates, I mean, there was a sense about that there would be one more rate cut, and then really, was there enough? The economists had always been saying there would be 2 or 3 rate cuts as we go down the line and the next few months. The arguments for that have been sort of balanced. This changes things because it's not that we expect export so much to the US, but all our trading partners, like China, South Korea, these are the major partners. Global growth and Australian GDP growth will not be as good as perhaps it was going to be, because the whole world economy is sort of frozen in time because of this backward step basically on tariffs. And so the argument to cut rates is strengthened. So suddenly you're starting to see them talking about 2 or 3 rates again, 2 or 3 rate cuts, which bring a rate possibly from 4 down, possibly closer to 3 this year, which is for all the wrong reasons, but nonetheless.
Yes, welcome by some.
It does mean your mortgage could drop, which is a silver lining, perhaps.
Yeah. James, thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. And just looking, James, at some of the descriptions, we heard Lauren there talking about how to describe this. There's been words like plunge, chaos, free fall, the worst day, as we mentioned, since 2020. So this is pretty extraordinary. Plenty of other things going on in the news, though, now. And let's go to Charles.
Thank you, Emma. Victoria's Court of Appeal will decide this morning if Victorian crime boss Tony Mokbel should be granted bail. The 59-year-old has been in prison for 18 years after being arrested in Greece, skipping bail while on trial for drug trafficking. Mokbel's barrister says he's in poor health and willing to comply with strict bail conditions. Authorities are investigating the death of a 31-year-old Aboriginal man in custody in Western Australia's Eastern Goldfields Region Prison. He was found unresponsive in his cell and later died in Kalgoorlie Hospital. The Department of Justice says there are no suspicious circumstances. It's the 14th death in custody in Australia this year and the 4th involving an Indigenous prisoner. Rainfall has finally eased in southwest Queensland. However, the Bureau of Meteorology expects riverine flooding to continue for days, if not weeks, meaning an anxious wait for displaced residents. A new nitazene has been detected in Australia for the first time as experts warn the country's black market drug supply is more contaminated than ever. Nitazenes are synthetic opioids that can be stronger than fentanyl and are increasingly found in counterfeit pharmaceuticals and illicit drugs. Australia's beaches are cleaner than they've been in a decade, with new CSIRO research showing a 39% drop in plastic pollution. Pollution levels were highest in built-up and disadvantaged areas, but the study also found a 16% rise in locations with no plastic at all. Well, the penguins and seals in the Australian territory of Heard and McDonald Islands have also been hit with US President Donald Trump's tariffs. The islands in the Antarctic do not have any permanent human settlements. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says nowhere on Earth is safe, with tariffs also levied on Norfolk Island and Christmas Island.